Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. This episode is recorded on Thursday, January 25th, 2018, starting at 3:54 or 3:53 p.m. in Denver, Colorado, and this is the 141st episode of the show. For more information about how to subscribe to the podcast and help support the production of future episodes by becoming a patron, please visit theastrologypodcast.com/subscribe. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with Dr. Safron Rossi about the life and work of the famous Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung and her new book, which explores his views on astrology, titled Jung on Astrology. Hi, Saffron. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Chris. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited. So we had a little bit of problems getting started today due to technical issues, but I think we've got it together, and I'm really excited about this episode because this is actually a really landmark book, or a really notable book, for a number of reasons that we'll discuss. So first, I wanted to start off just by introducing you to my audience and talking a little bit about your background. So could you tell me who you are and where you're from and what your background in this field is?
Yeah, so I am a professor of mythology and depth psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute, where I teach in a program that focuses on the work of Jung and post-Jungian archetypal theory. Um, and I'm also a scholar and a writer and an astrologer. So I kind of wear these different aspects of my both sort of scholarly and creative endeavors. And Pacifica's in California, which I moved to in 2003 to start graduate school. But I come from New York City, so I'm an East Coaster originally.
Okay. Did you move to, so Pacifica is also where Richard Tarnas teaches, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
his work has sort of revolved around there. Did you move to or go to Pacifica specifically already with some background or interest in astrology, or is that something that came up during the course of your studies there?
That actually came later. So I have my PhD in mythological studies, and pretty much all my life I've been very interested, passionate, and curious about mythology and legends. And I remember when I was in college and I was studying religious studies and comparative literature, I had this really strong, but at the same time vague sense that myth and legend and fairy tales were really important, but I didn't know why. I mean, meaning they were important beyond the study of culture and history and literature, but they meant something. But, being 20, 21, I think, at least for me, my psychological understanding was so nascent and not very well developed that it was in applying to graduate school and going to Pacifica and beginning to study mythology from an explicitly depth psychological perspective that sort of intuitive knowing that I had when I was young really started to fill out through my studies. So astrology was always in the background. But it actually wasn't until I had finished my doctoral dissertation and was kind of in that postpartum period after any major creative project, where I went to a very small lecture that Rick Tarnas was giving in Santa Barbara. It wasn't actually at Pacifica, but hosted through people that were related in the community sense. And listening
What
to
sort of time
him.
frame was that? Sorry for interrupting.
Oh, so that was around 2008, 2009.
Okay.
Um, and, listening to Rick Tarnas talk about the planets in these, in a distinctly archetypal sense, meaning as forces of values or styles of consciousness or rhythmic energy patterns, I was just blown away. And I realized listening to him that astrology in many ways is the sort of binding bridge between mythology, the study of mythology, the narratives, the images, the complexity, and our psychological experience, meaning, how do we make sense of periods of time and, times of crisis and difficulty? And somehow astrology is the most perfect way to bridge those two areas, both the mythic sensibility and a sense of the unfolding or deepening of our psychological experience of life. So that was it. Like Tarnas just kind of like had me recognize, what was a kind of living practice to bridge those two parts, I suppose is another way to put it.
Sure, and that would have been just a couple of years after his book Cosmos and Psyche came out then. So that's a really
Right.
rich period in terms of, what he had initiated and what was going on in that area during that time frame.
That's right. And he had come, whenever Rick comes to Pacifica, his conferences sell out. I mean, he's such an amazing speaker and holds that kind of balance between a deep love for intellectual and historical inquiry, and at the same time, this very expansive feeling for the sort of archetypal structures or energies that are embedded within life. So it's just an amazing combination of approaches to the topic. Um, so yeah,
Sure.
Cosmos and Psyche, I would say, has definitely been a bit of a watershed moment or a watershed publication, in terms of modern astrology, and how we think about it.
Right. Well, and your story is really interesting to me because I was watching it from the other side of the fence. I don't know, within the astrological community already, and seeing him put out a book where he's explicitly trying to make the case to, modern uh, intellectuals, basically, that there's something to astrology, and it's, worth paying attention to, and here's the case for why. And there was
Mm.
always this question at the time. I remember when it came out, I was still at Kepler, and we all sat around at one symposium and read like the New York Times review of it. And we were wondering to what extent it would actually, bring in anybody from academia, or to what extent it would be viewed as compelling or convincing to anyone. So hearing you as a story of somebody who came in from academia, who already had your PhD, and then was in being exposed to that, that it did actually feel compelling to you and sort of drew you into the field, or developed, led to an interest in astrology, is really interesting to me.
Yeah, very much. It was like seeing how all of these theoretical ideas, Jungian ideas about the development of the self or individuation, and the way that we use mythology to amplify and personify and really deepen into that process. The way Tarnas looks at astrology, it holds both ends. Now, after um, you know, having my mind blown by Tarnas. And then I started to do my own research. I mean, of course, I came to the work of other astrologers that were doing this. But yeah, it was Tarnas's approach that um, kind of flipped the switch for me.
Sure. And
Yeah.
so, and at that point, obviously, you already would have had a pretty deep background in Jung, and that's what you
Mm.
already came into astrology with, was, I'm assuming, was a familiarity with Jung and his work because of your focus on mythology, right?
That's right. Yeah. So, and not only Jung, but also James Hillman, the founder of archetypal psychology. So, yeah. So I was coming at astrology with a very strong grounding in those two thinkers' ideas, who necessitate and almost make primary symbolic languages by which to understand the psyche.
Sure, sure.
Hmm.
And that leads us then to the sort of topic of this episode, which is that you just published a book titled Jung on Astrology, which is a compilation of excerpts of different statements that Jung made in writing over the course of his career about astrology. And so, how did this book come about, or what was the starting point of it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in a very like simple, frank way, I was really curious about what Jung had written about astrology and kind of wanted an excuse to learn more about that specifically. And so, as no doubt you know, there's nothing like learning a topic. There's no better way to learn something than to be writing about it, right? Or
Right.
to be researching it in depth. So that was kind of my original inspiration, which was, well, what did Jung really have to say? And beginning to gather pieces and Routledge, who is the publisher of this book, there's a series of books that have been called the Jung on series. So there's like Jung on alchemy, Jung on synchronicity, so these different volumes that people have edited to help distill his ideas on a particular topic because he was an incredibly prolific writer. And so there's a lot of material um, to be able to pour through when you're trying to understand his take on a particular idea.
Right. This book,
And
the
s
book
mm,
Jung on Synchronicity and the Paranormal, was
mm.
actually assigned reading at Kepler back around
Oh,
2004, 2005. So, that was actually a pretty influential book on me. So it's interesting then seeing this as a new edition in that series of sort of breaking up Jung's work on different topics into specific volumes that focus on them. And this was one that was missing until now, which is what did he actually say about astrology?
right, exactly. And making it easier for people to explore that on their own, I think is important. And Also, I think for me, I was really invested in um, trying to contribute something in this more sort of old school academic way, like putting together an edited volume of a luminary's work as a way of helping to establish this topic in a way that maybe necessarily really hasn't been represented so clearly. If that makes sense. Like that this is a volume that people can now assign in curriculum, whether it's at a more depth psychologically oriented school or in astrological programs. And so that there's more primary, direct understanding and exploration of Jung's ideas. And that felt like an important contribution to make. Um,
Yeah,
so,
definitely. I mean, because Jung was such an influential thinker in the 20th century on a number of different fields. And there's, anybody that reads some of his works will see these little bits and pieces and references to astrology and different things, but there's never been a full collection of what he actually said. And this very much lets him speak for himself. It's not just,
mm,
necessarily commentary or picking out different statements and then writing chapters of exposition about them. It's literally excerpts from his writings that's all in one place, so that you can, for the first time, point to or cite something. If anyone says, that Jung practiced astrology, there's actually now a book where you can point to exactly what that means in a very literal sense.
right, right.
All right, excellent. So, and this is you actually co-authored this book, and you were the one that first proposed the idea of putting it together, right?
Yeah, yeah. I had come up on the idea and I had been sort of, sitting on it for a little while. And then Kieran LaGrace, who is the co editor of the volume, he joined the faculty in the program that I teach in, that we now both teach in, the Jungian and Archetypal Studies program at Pacifica. and he joined the faculty. We had known one another. We were kind of acquaintances, but when he joined the faculty, it just becoming colleagues, and it just seemed like a really natural project to take on together, given his own deep study and practice of astrology, and also to a certain degree, our areas of focus seem very complementary, because Kieran, who studied at CIIS and was a student of Rick Tarnas's and has published quite a lot on the discipline that out of the Rick Tarnas school, archetypal cosmology and astrology. It seemed like a really great fit for us to come together to look at Jung, because Kieran has a particularly kind of philosophical, intellectual history background when it comes to astrology. Like, where does it come from, and what are the various influences and ideas? Whereas I come more from the mythopoetic side, the symbolism and the kind of roots of the images and their sort of literary, expressions, and how that comes through. So it just seemed like a really good fit and a fun project to take on together, and camaraderie and all of that. So
Yeah, definitely. And he seems like one of the most, if not the most prominent student to come out of or to follow
mm,
in the wake of Tarnas's Cosmos and Psyche, and some the sort of school or the approach that he set up with that. It seems like he is definitely not the main or only representative, but certainly one of the most prominent ones in terms of the
mhm.
number of books and other things that he's published over the past, I guess, decade now. Um, yeah, so I can see why that would really make sense, or would be a good collaboration in terms of the two of you working on this together.
Yeah, exactly. And he just has a wonderful feeling for this, um, you know, the validity, and I mean that in the sense of the value of the astrological paradigm in relationship to life, and how it helps us make conscious and make sort of accessible these deeper experiences that we have, and ways to work with them. So.
Sure. And in reading through the book over the past week, I was really struck by how much many of the basic premises or principles that school that Tarnas incorporated into his work in Cosmos and Psyche, and then that school of astrology that he sort of set up, or that approach to archetypal astrology, how many of the foundational principles were things that do seem to go back to Jung, or that
Mm.
Jung, you can see him sort of formulating in his writings. And I was kind of struck by that, because I don't know if I had forgotten, or it would just become not clear how much of that was being drawn from Jung's works or influenced in a very direct way early on, and not necessarily by intermediaries like Rudyard or later astrologers.
Right.
So that provides us then with a good transition point, which is basically the purpose of this episode. Was I wanted to talk to you about the life and work of Carl Jung, and talk a little bit about who he was, what he did and why his work is significant, what he thought about astrology, and then finally what his influence was on the astrological tradition. So that's kind of a tall order, but I think we can pull it off. So why don't we
Okay.
start by just introducing my audience, assuming that they have no background on who this person is. Tell me a little bit about who he was and what time frame he lived in.
Okay, so Carl Gustav Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist. He was born 1875 and died in 1961. And sidebar, Mick Jagger and Carl Jung have the same birthday.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so
Well,
I
not
just
not year, but you mean day and
no,
month.
no.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. Mick Jagger does seem to be really, making it last a long century, but
Yeah, he
right,
does
same
seem
day.
immortal at this point.
Right. So Jung was born in 1875 and died in 1961, and lived in Switzerland his whole life. And um, early in his career, he was a colleague of Freud's, which is generally a kind of well-known association. But Jung and Freud parted ways after a period of intense collaboration, um, mainly over Jung's differing psychological theories, which came to emphasize what we now talk about as the collective unconscious.
Right, and that's really important. Their connection
Mm.
is important and notable just from a historical standpoint, just because of who Freud was and what his significance was in founding what essentially became the modern approach to psychology, right?
Yeah, and a depth, a psychology that values primarily the existence and the reality of the unconscious. Yeah.
Sure.
Mm,
And in terms of Freud, I mean, just to, especially for some of our younger listeners who may not have a background in like the history of psychology,
mm,
psychology in its modern or depth psychology is a relatively recent development, or it's something that I noticed that Jung sort of emphasized a few times in his writing and acknowledging and reflecting on his own life and work, how relatively recent depth psychology was as a sort of science or development over the course of the past century, right?
that's right. And I mean, without wanting to get too complex too early on, I mean, and part of the reason why depth psychology is quite nascent and new is that one could argue, as Jung has in various places, that with the decline of strong and complete sort of religious containers for people's life experiences, meaning belonging to a religious group, or living within a kind of religious mythology. The breakdown of that in our modern era has led to um, uh, great challenges psychologically for people, where one's moral compass, one's sense of values, one's idea about the way the world works, or the order of things, or the ultimate importance of certain things, in losing that which has been the domain of religious and or spiritual practices, people began to suffer in a way and couldn't find um, need help, in managing some of these experiences. So psychology, in a depth psychology, in a way, is a kind of response to these collective um, changes that are really unprecedented in the history of humankind.
Sure. And Freud was at the forefront of that and laying a
Mm,
lot of what became sort of foundational principles in the late 19th and early 20th century, right?
that's right. That's right.
Okay. So he's doing that work and he was like about 20 years older than Jung. And then Jung came along at one point and almost became, it seemed like a protege of Freud or something close to that. Is that maybe taking it too far?
No, actually, I think that that's pretty accurate in some of the last exchanges between Freud and Jung in their correspondence. Freud talks about how, as if on the eve of Freud sort of anointing Jung as his kind of son and heir to this field of psychology, their parting of ways was kind of planted within the middle of that. So the sense that they were very close, that Freud in some way really saw Jung as stepping in to kind of take the mantle of this field forward, I think is quite evident.
Sure. And
Mm.
what was the time frame? Because they in terms of like the full span of their lives, because they both lived to be relatively old, they really were only associated for a relatively short span of time. But what was that time frame again in terms of when they started talking with each other and when they stopped talking with each other?
Oh my goodness. I don't have that at my fingertips, but I
Okay, so
think that, yeah, I
I think it
think
was like
that
1906 or 1907, and
right to about 1912 or 13.
yeah, so we're talking about like
Mm-hmm.
a decade or less than a decade, but there was like an explosion as soon as they found each other. There was like an explosion of correspondence between the two, right?
That's right. That's right. And a sense that, I mean, now this gets into, well, part of so I think part of the connection between Jung and Freud, if we look at what was going on for Jung or his history, it helps us begin to understand why he was drawn to Freud. Jung underwent a long apprenticeship working with schizophrenic patients, schizophrenic or psychotic patients at the Bergholzli Institute in Switzerland. And that's where he became aware of the mythological or archetypal dimensions of the psyche. And it was also at the Bergholzli that Jung began conducting experiments using things such as the word association test to develop the notion of psychological complexes. So, like, as he's in, living and working at this, institute with, patients that are in altered states of consciousness, and doing his studies, he begins to see what Freud is up to in his own work. And I think that's where the link starts to happen because Freud, was working with people who also had, um, uh, very challenging complexes or neuroses that were impeding, the living of life, the living of a relatively, um, healthy or well-adjusted kind of a life. So their finding each other comes from both of their working with individuals that have kind of profound difficulty, and then there's studies coming out of that.
Sure. And this sort of like developing field of, what did they call it? Like the talking cure or something in the early 20th
Hmm.
century?
That's right. Yeah, that's Freud called it the talking cure. Yeah,
Okay. And
yeah.
so they find each other, they have this very productive period of interaction. And eventually, though, they went separate ways, and there was
Mm.
like there was a their differences grew to such extent that they stopped talking with each other, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it just has to do with their firm convictions around certain um, kind of what they understood to be kind of indisputable or primary ideas regarding the psyche, and they just had different perspectives on um, some of these topics and couldn't sort of find a way. Um, to not I mean, it almost feels very alchemical in the way that at some point certain chemicals are repelled by one another, right? And it just kind of feels like it came to a place where there was um, an intense repelling away from the way that each one was really, doing their work and what they were focused on.
Sure. Yeah, that notion of almost like opposites attract, but then at some point sometimes can conflict so much that they drive each other away. And it seemed like part of the falling out was that Jung had some interests in sort of esoteric and spiritual, sort of quasi spiritual type ideas, and often would try to incorporate that into his psychological models, whereas Freud did not, or that was not typically something that Freud was incorporating into his work, at least not in the same way that Jung did, right?
Right. Jung was always interested in topics that seemed to be outside mainstream thought. So early on, like when he was doing his own theses research, he did research on the paranormal. And throughout his career, he was interested in esoteric traditions such as Gnosticism and alchemy. He wrote a book on UFO phenomenon. So, he was both a serious scientist, and, he was an MD, a doctor, and someone who is extremely interested in the things that challenged the limits of our knowledge. And I think astrology obviously fits into this context.
Sure, and that's basically where astrology starts coming in. It seems like, as far as we know, in terms of his writings, is that in some of the letters, which you guys actually quote in this book from very early in his career, I think as early as 1911, he starts talking to Freud or attempting to talk to Freud about astrology and almost convince him that there's something to it and that he thinks it might be useful. And interestingly, from your perspective and your background, he almost seems to say that his initial approach or reason motivation for looking into it is that he thinks it'll help him in terms of his studies of mythology.
Right. Isn't that interesting? I remember the first time I came across that quote. And there's something about Jung, and I've heard other people share this too, that he has this reading Jung, there's this uncanny way in which he says things that like but maybe you haven't just articulated quite fully. Do you know
Sure.
what I mean by that?
Yeah, definitely.
Because you just feel like you're right there with him, and you're like, yes, totally, of course. And I couldn't have said it, but I'm so glad that you did. So in that particular excerpt where he talks about astrology really being like one of the keys to understanding myth, and of course we're talking about a symbolic sensibility. I think that's right on, because I mean, if we think about one of the, you know, again, for some of the listeners that maybe aren't so familiar with Freud, I mean, I think it's kind of common parlance, the idea of the Oedipus complex, coming from Freud, as well as the Freudian slip. But what was so groundbreaking about Freud talking about Oedipus in relationship to um, some of his patients' fantasies about incest was that Freud was really curious and privileging the imaginal capacity, meaning the way in which we um, make stories in order to give expression to our particular take on reality. So, by bringing in the Oedipus myth as a way to try to understand patients' as experiences of the fantasy of incest or whatever that was, um, he's showing how our psychological experience is, in and of itself, kind of mythological. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that'll actually lead us into talking about some of his broader, that section about why his work was significant and some of the theories that he came up with, and maybe
Mm-hmm.
that would be a good transition point, and then we can come back to, talking about his sort of chronology. Does that make sense, or should we keep going with
Yeah,
his?
no, that's fine. However, yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah,
Okay.
because we have some of these key ideas that, yeah, to kind of just touch on a little bit.
Yeah, well, let's jump into it right now because that'll set a good foundation for the rest of discussing the rest of his career as well as why, perhaps he fell out with Freud. So, what were some of the key things that Jung did in terms of his work? Speaking of it in terms of his entire career and some of the key ideas or theories that he introduced, which really characterize it or are yeah characteristic of it in some way.
Okay, so let's probably go back to how I mentioned when Jung was at the Bergholzli doing his apprenticeship. He was um, conducting experiments like the word association test, which came to help him develop the notion of a psychological complex. So complexes, or a complex, is, I think, one of the ways to define it is that it's a thematic grouping of psychological contents. For example, memories, emotional responses that usually originate in childhood. So that's why we have these common terms like mother and father complex, right? Like, oh my God, she's got such a father complex. Well, the idea there is that for a person, maybe her personal experiences with her father and then with professors or teachers or authority figures, they create a kind of energy grouping in her psyche, and so there it can get triggered in relationship to certain experiences. So it's hence a grouping of psychological contents coming together. But what's interesting is that Jung eventually came to understand that archetypal or universal themes lay deeply within our personal complexes. And I think this is one of the doors that opens to considering, astrology. Um, so,
Right. So what is,
yeah,
I mean, and that's core to his thinking, the notion of an archetype,
the
and
archetype.
what is an archetype, or what is
Okay.
in Jung's thought, how did he formulate, or what was his formulation of that concept?
Right.
Or
Okay.
basically just what is an archetype if you're explaining it to
Mhm.
somebody who's never heard of the idea before?
So, an archetype is a formative principle or pattern that shapes our behaviors, our ideas, um, and they can also be symbols that have a universal quality that have appeared throughout human history.
Sure. So reoccurring sort of themes or things. I mean, so this is a concept that goes back to like the philosophy of Plato, who's usually associated with sometimes first formulating a concept of archetypes in some
Hmm.
sense, right?
That's right. That's right. So it does harken back to that. Um, but the thing, there's two levels here in that an archetype is this kind of formative principle or pattern, and as Jung says, in and of itself, meaning in its most pure form, we can't see or know what an archetype is. We only know it. Um, by the images or symbols that arise and by the ways that it's experienced. That is often um, a big piece that I think we can see that's a kind of an argument that's leveled against Jung, saying that, well, archetypes are like these fixed, unchanging, kind of images or ideas, and that's not true, because in at least not in the way that we more deeply understand Jung, which is that we only experience an archetype because of the way that it comes through historical, cultural, and individual valences, right? We're all affected by our environment, our personal history, our collective history. So, so the simplest way to maybe sort of think about this too is that, the archetype of the trickster. The trickster is present in all mythologies around the world, right? In the Greek, Roman tradition, we've got Hermes, Mercury. In the Native American traditions, we have Coyote. And we have Loki coming to us from the Nordic tradition. So the trickster is an archetypal figure who has a very kind of defined character, and yet, the way that different cultures and peoples have rendered or manifested that figure has been very specific to both the time and the place in which those stories were told.
Sure. Or even just to break it down much more simply for those maybe struggling with this, it's like in Plato, it was the concept of like the overarching concept of like a tree. And there are many different specific manifestations of trees that we've seen in the world, but the idea that there's like a transcendent quality that has all of the overarching qualities of what a tree is, that manifests in different ways in sort of the actual physical world, right?
Right. Yeah. And then on a personal level, you know, the we can say that, a journey is archetypal, right? What it is to leave what we know and enter the world, or enter a new territory, going on a journey, whether that's literal or even sort of psychological, going on an investigation of something, trying to understand the journey. But each person is going to have their own way of dealing with venturing out into the unknown. So the very act is archetypal, but the way you approach venturing into an unknown land is going to be very different from the way that I do.
Right. And so Jung took that notion of an archetype, and then he started looking at how archetypes arose in things like mythology. So before I sort of interrupted you with the tree example, you were talking about like the notion of the trickster, and that being like an archetype or a concept that he saw showing up in the mythology of many different cultures in different ways, but that somehow there seemed to be something behind that was like a unifying principle that was representing the same underlying concept, even if some of the details and nuances of how that story manifested in different cultures was slightly different, right?
Exactly. So, the idea being that there are archetypal patterns to experience. There are archetypal figures that are connected in terms of their underlying structure or characteristics, but that have, based on the time and place in which they have come forward, carry all these unique kind of idiosyncratic qualities. Um, so I mean, with not wanting to pick such a common one, but the hero is another archetypal figure that, like the trickster, is ubiquitous, and there is a definitive pattern to the hero as an archetypal figure, but the way in which that can be represented seems endless, right? Endless possibilities.
Right, of the hero as an archetype in mythology. And so Jung
Mm-hmm.
took this idea of the archetype, which seems like a really foundational principle in his thinking and in his approach, and applied it to study many different areas. This idea that there's archetypes out there, and he applied it to mythology in the way that we're talking about here, but he also applied it, like you were saying earlier, in psychology, that you could see archetypes manifesting in different sort of psychological scenarios as well, right?
Yeah, I think the way to kind of think about the relationship between archetypes and mythology and the way that Jung meant it was that myths, the gods, the heroes, the crazy characters, are the archetypes personified. It's like we can't see an archetype unless it's being enacted. And for time immemorial, they have been enacted in the great mythological stories from all cultures. So when we're talking about, um, it's the way in which humans have been connected to these, transpersonal values or attitudes through the images of divinity, and spiritual forms. So myths are the archetypes in motion, and psychologically, we experience those archetypal energies in our lives. So the way in which someone as a baby, our mother and our father, generally, hopefully, are sort of the prime divinities that give life, nurturance, sustenance, you see? And so we attribute in a very sort of innocent, nascent kind of a way that the energy of the archetypal to the people and experiences that we have in our life. And I
Right.
think, probably nothing kind of hits closer to home if people are trying to kind of square this as when we fall in love, right? I mean,
Sure, the
falling in love
archetype,
is
like the
archetypal.
archetype or the concept of falling in love.
Yeah. Yeah, where we literally feel like something has happened to us, that there's a power drawing us toward another person, or all of, the way life can all of a sudden seem kind of filled with meaningfulness and hopefulness and light. I mean, all of that is really psychic energy. And so there's something that's awakened. We're connected to archetypal energy in in the deeper mysteries of falling in love or being in love.
Sure. And connected with this idea of archetypes is also another important concept that is often associated with Jung, it seems like, or that he really pioneered and his school is known for, which is the notion of the collective unconscious. Could
Mm.
you talk a little bit about what that is or how he conceptualized that?
Yeah, so the collective unconscious is a term that he used to talk about basically that deep riverbed of mythological or archetypal images that connect humanity. So, talking about, Aphrodite or Coyote, Hermes, all of these figures, um, in a way, live within or come from the collective unconscious because they belong to the history of humanity and not to an individual. So, the collective unconscious is the place where these great formative or structural patterns of life, the archetypes, sort of live or come from.
Right. So it's sort of
Mm.
the realm where the archetypes are, and it's something that exists almost out there independently of like an individual life, or becomes the reason why you could have a recurring archetype that shows up in one person's life in like a century or two ago, and then in modern day somebody has a life and they experience a certain scenario or a certain archetype in the same way or in a similar fashion, and it's because the archetypes are living in this area called the collective unconscious.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's a beautiful kind of image that Jung gives of this. He has this really great autobiography called Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And anyone who isn't really familiar with Jung but is getting curious listening to this, I think it's the best first book to read, because this was written toward the end of his life, and so he has that beautiful sort of retrospective perspective, right? That having lived a very full life, he can look back and talk about his main ideas, theoretically, conceptually, but in relationship to his lived experience. And he recounts this dream he has where he's in a dream house, and he's standing in this room in the house, and it was a very nicely appointed house, and he's kind of impressed with himself, thinking, wow, what a very nice dream house I have. And he notices that there's a stairway leading down out of this room, and he's curious, and so in the dream he walks down a staircase, and down the next level there's another room, but it's maybe more kind of rococo in style, let's say like 17th century, so it's a couple of hundred years older than the first room. And he's like, oh, this is interesting. He descends another floor, and then there he's kind of in a more Roman style room. And then he descends even further until he gets to the bottom, and he's in a very kind of primal cave like room. And that idea, that last room, that bottom room that seems to be the basement and also the foundation for all the rooms above, is really an image of the collective unconscious, and how going deeper and deeper in history, in time, we can come to some connected ground from which all of history, both personal and collective and cultural, sort of emerges from, or at least is informed by.
Sure. And that story is great because it points to one of the key things that Jung, it seems like he was doing constantly, which was interpreting things in a symbolic, from a symbolic standpoint, as holding greater meaning or symbolism in a way that was relevant and valid, including things like dreams, which other sort of psychologists were involved in interpreting, like Freud, who was also interested in dream interpretation, but would interpret it as being like outgrowths of like of sexual impulses or other things like that, whereas Jung was interpreting things like that symbolically as containing important information that was coming from the realm of the unconscious or the archetypes or what have you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you've put it really well. And I think that what you've said is actually pinpointing one of the key understandings that differentiate Jung's view of the psyche from other early theorists. And that is his sense that there is a deeper organizing principle at work in the lives of all of us. And whatever this organizing principle is, it drives the process of what he called individuation. And individuation, which it may have an unconscious goal or a hidden purpose for the individual. I mean, I think individuation is really also one of the key ideas, key theories of Jung's, but it's deeply life affirming. This idea that even if we're not conscious of it, that there's something moving us, driving us toward a greater wholeness of who we can be. And I don't mean that in a kind of new age affirmation sort of a way. I mean that very much in the sense of becoming more connected to the unconscious and having our consciousness and our unconscious be in a kind of dialogue that in and of itself is related to creativity, a sense of meaningfulness in our life, a sense of being connected to something that's much bigger than us and yet has our best interest in mind somehow.
Right, and Jung saw this, which he called individuation, as the goal or like the purpose of not just psychology, but also what each individual is moving towards or striving towards in their life as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully. I mean, just in the term individuation, as the word itself suggests, what does it take to really be an authentic individual? Meaning, to be living life on the terms that are discreetly your own, but not just from a kind of ego, willful perspective, but in the sense of like what it is that really you need to fulfill or live into in your life. And knowing what that is from a depth perspective, that doesn't come from just our goal setting kind of meditation. Learning what that is really comes from being in a deep relationship with the unconscious.
Sure. So, and that becomes part of his purpose or what he sees as his goal in what he's doing in terms of helping people individually in terms of psychological analysis, right?
That's right. That's right. And I think, to me, the astrological view shares this same sort of orientation, this idea that the chart reveals an image of becoming, that we need an individual, I need to fulfill my cosmological blueprint or seed, or how we some more explicitly Jungian astrologers talk about the birth chart as a symbol of potential. So, and in that sense, it's not about just reacting to our birth chart, but rather living into it, right? um and so, yeah,
Right.
I
Yeah.
don't want
No,
to
I mean,
go too
taken from that
fast, but
perspective, if
mm,
if that's his goal with psychology, you can immediately then see why he would have been attracted very early on to something like astrology, to whatever extent astrology could help one understand that, or strive towards some of the hidden, not just psychological complexes that one has, but the things that a person is growing or moving towards in terms of their overall life development.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So I guess we could say that the psychological attitude to problems or symptoms that Jung encouraged was to have patients find within themselves the seed of new potential or growth. So, not simply focusing on the cause of the problem or the symptom, but rather, how do you approach it as being a kind of opening?
Right, and using sort of dialogue and exploration of that in order to get to the core underlying themes, which then can in turn lead to actual healing of not just the outcome of whatever the person is suffering from in the immediate moment, but the root causes of what's causing that in some sense.
That's right. And I think, I mean, you can say healing because hopefully that's what happens after we're doing this kind of big work. But what might precede, or rather, what makes that even remotely a possibility is consciousness, meaning when we become conscious of the underlying issue, attitude, opinion, or problem that really lives underneath whatever the particular issue or situation is, the very act of being open to seeing what lies under our general purview, that is an act of that's a spark of consciousness. That's an act of connecting to something deeper. And just that contact, so to speak, the contact of our awareness to what lies beneath our awareness that more fully informs what's been going on, that that's the change. That's the kind of transformative hit that can lead to, healing, resolution, and if nothing else, more clarity.
Sure, that makes sense.
Mm. Mm.
Um, and so Jung, using some of these like concepts and foundational principles that he developed, eventually developed a sort of school or an approach to psychology or psychoanalysis, and became very notable during the course of his career, and had a lot of people who followed or emulated that approach, that then, is a major approach to psychology today at this point, right?
That's right.
Okay. So
Yeah.
that's sort of part of the context then. And in terms of mainstream psychology, though, as a sort of outsider, somebody that doesn't have a lot of background in this, I got the sense that I often get the sense that Jung, because of his and the Jungian approach, because of its openness and sometimes orientation towards more spiritual or mythological, or sometimes almost quasi-religious concepts, that it's not fully within the mainstream movement of like mainstream psychology, but it's still otherwise has made some major contributions to it, and is still a major sort of school of psychology that's relatively well recognized. Is that more or less accurate, or how would you frame that?
Yeah, no, I think that is, well, yes, I think that is accurate. And I mean, I mean, one way to approach this point is that, you know, why is Jung's work significant in the field of psychology? And for me, I would say that it has to do with the way he attempted to meld together the wisdom of the past with modern psychological understanding and methods of treatment. So that Jung's psychology is one that grows organically from traditional understandings, particularly in the realms of spirituality, religion, mythology, and comparative symbolism. And in an era where psychology was becoming increasingly behavioral and rationalistic, Jung insisted on the importance of a spiritual life because that has been the sort of core of the human experience from time immemorial. Why would all of a sudden now would the spiritual life really not be so important? I mean that's it's a really big question.
Right.
And I think we're seeing it's the same issue today. It hasn't changed very much. Mainstream psychology is very behavioral, very rationalistic. There's a great investment in neurological exploration, none of which is all of which ought to be explored, but it comes at it when you read the orientations and principles of um, cognitive behavioral and other schools of psychology. They um, it's a very different sense about the life of the soul and the value of our symptoms and suffering, which, looking at it from the perspective of the past, the life of the soul and the issues that come through our suffering are callings from the spirit. They're openings for a different perspective or the budding of wisdom of some kind. So it's a very different way of thinking about the life of the soul.
Sure. Well, I mean, even just that setting it apart is an acknowledgement of the notion of the soul or the psyche as and having some sort of spiritual component versus maybe a more mainstream psychological approach of seeing things in purely almost like physiological terms or something like that.
Right, or a mechanistic, right?
Right.
So yeah, so I think to me that piece about bridging the wisdom of the past in relationship to our contemporary issues, needs, and kind of vision of treatment is really um, uh, just really key when it comes to Jung. Um,
Sure. And that
and
brings us.
and
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
oh yeah, no, I was gonna wax poetic about the importance of history, but I think the point's been made. So
Yeah, well, and we'll actually circle back around there, but this brings us back then. We can loop back now to his story because that then provides us better context to understand than that split with Freud. Because almost like right there in that split with Freud, there's something for us looking back almost like a century later now where we can almost see what became like the modern psychology in some sense and some of the reductionistic thinking, even though large parts of Freud's thinking are not have since been rejected or not necessarily still part of contemporary psychology. There's something about the motivations and some of the reasons behind their split that's very interesting today, now looking back at what mainstream psychology is versus what Jung's approach is and the things that he did incorporate into his work. I mean, is that accurate? Am I taking that too far? I'm not sure.
yeah, I mean,
I mean, I
I
realize
don't know.
that's partially
Yeah,
depending on what sort of school of psychology that you're looking at, perhaps, or maybe it's difficult to make like a blanket statement about an entire field like that. But I guess I was just
right.
thinking of the extent to which Jung was open to incorporating other things like astrology into his work and recognizing what you could almost classify as like metaphysical concepts, like the idea of an archetype or the idea of a collective unconscious, are almost quasi metaphysical or spiritualistic type concepts that I'm not sure. I mean, to what extent those are usually recognized by mainstream psychology today.
I mean, and I think that's right. And this, goes back to Jung's lifelong fascination with the occult and esoteric traditions and topics. But again, I think if we see them as having been at one point, whether it's um, divination or alchemy or astrology as having been really central symbolic languages that lived at the heart of certain cultures and at certain periods of time and were like taken for granted in terms of their truthfulness or their view on reality. Jung was recognizing them in that way, meaning that like astrology, for example, had for centuries been understood to be an absolutely valid way of understanding individuals, periods of time. And so he didn't just he didn't take as a privilege our modern position to say that, well, it doesn't make sense anymore. You see what I mean? It's like it's this he really valued these kind of esoteric traditions as having been the containers of knowledge for the past and therefore can still be containers of knowledge today if we know how to work with them or look at them with a more psychological, metaphorical, symbolic sensibility and not as literal fact. You see?
Right. I think we can
Mm,
understand, like, having outlined some of those things in terms of the
mm,
ideas that were key ideas in his thought, why then very early on in his career he would have developed an interest in astrology and would have
mm,
recognized very quickly. One of the quotes I pulled out of the book at one point was he said that, quote unquote, astrology was the first form of psychology, which is an
mm,
extremely young science dating from the end of the 19th century only. So he's recognizing sort of psychology, modern psychology is a relatively recent development, but that many of the things that he's trying to do with psychology or many of the things that he's recognizing, he can see pieces of that already pre-existing in astrology, not only in terms of things like the use of natal charts in order to look at, whatever you want to call it, psychological complexes, but using astrology as an access point for understanding archetypes, especially through the planets, and the planets themselves being an excellent access point for understanding core archetypal dynamics that are sort of in effect in different parts of the world.
that's right. I mean, absolutely. And we can even sort of take the word archetype out of that and just say that, you know, Jung understood astrology to be this ancient symbolic language that provides insight into the workings of the psyche. It's like how do the elements of the psyche, which of course are partially the archetypes, how do they work? Or how are they working for this particular individual, right? What are the challenges? So yeah. Yeah, you're right on.
Right. And we finally, now that we can talk about the planets and how he and astrology in general and what his thoughts were, we can immediately also kind of relate that concept of an archetype back to something astrologically, because one of the things that's come up a few times over and over again, actually, on the podcast is how I think it was in the last episode, we were talking about Saturn and the concept of Saturn, and we read an excerpt from the second century astrologer Vedius Valens, and then we read an excerpt from just the significations given in Tarnas's work, Cosmos and Psyche. And one of the things about that holds together sort of the astrological tradition and how they deal with the planets is it's always this long list of significations, because you can't actually articulate an astrological archetype, because it's like this transcendent
Mm,
concept that can manifest in hundreds of different ways. All you
mm,
can do is understand the hundreds or thousands of different manifestations. And then through looking at all those different significations, you start to develop in your mind the concept of what the overarching notion
mm,
is. But there's still something where you can't articulate necessarily, you can't put into words, like you can't use a single word or sentence that will bring together that entire concept and all of its many manifestations. Instead, you just have this idea that Saturn sort of can represent these many things, for example.
that's right. Yeah, I think that's great. And I think in many ways you've just said in another way what I was saying about the difference between an archetype and an archetypal image. It's like th- you can't say what Saturn is, but you can talk about all the ways Saturn works us, shows up, how we experience it, the qualities, his qualities, his characteristics, right? And so in that sense, those are all the archetypal images. Whereas the archetype, Saturn, well, it's beyond our ken. Like we can't fix it. We can't name it, but we can talk about it in relationship to how it appears.
Right, right.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So Jung was a psychologist, but he was or psychoanalyst, or I'm not sure what is the correct. I guess he's referred to as a psychiatrist.
Well,
So
he was a psychiatrist, but Freudians and Jungians call themselves psychoanalysts as well. So it's kind of there's always a lot of different terminology. So so he was a psychoanalyst,
okay, so he
psychiatrist.
and he did that, and he did that individual work with individual people in direct one-on-one sessions, but he also had this very
Mm,
strong academic background where he was very like extremely well read, and he seemed to have loved to read literature on ancient history and ancient authors of philosophy and religion and science and occult matters and all sorts of different things. And that seems like part of the sort of necessary understanding in terms of who he was and what his contributions were is he had this just tremendous sort of breadth of understanding of the past in terms of trying to
mm.
understand the past and draw various insights from what people were doing in it that could be relevant in modern times, right?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, and I think your use of the word tremendous is right on. I mean, his the breadth of his knowledge and his curiosity is just really astounding when you kind of start digging into his work and to see all the directions he went in. Yeah.
Yeah, and he seems to have had some. So he spoke German was his first language, but it looks like he read Latin, and it looks like he may have also read Greek. Do you know if he
Mm.
had training in Greek
Well,
offhand?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think that was, I mean, I don't know for a fact, but my understanding is that that would have been sort of um, par for the course in terms of classical education.
Right, during that time frame in like the late 19th, early 20th century.
Right.
So that's really interesting because it's different than, today where he would have had the ability to go back and read the primary source texts in their original language. And
Mm,
moreover, he didn't just have the ability to do that, but he did. And you can see in his writings where he'll talk about like a Gnostic text and from the second century, and he'll actually quote it, or he'll talk about the work of Nostradamus and he'll actually cite some specific passage. So he
right.
was very interested in not just studying primary sources, but also talking about and analyzing them in some sense.
That's right. That's right. I mean, and I have to admit, like, this is one of those moments where I just feel like I was born in the wrong era. I don't know about you, but I would have loved to have learned Latin and Greek in school.
Oh yeah, no, I mean that's
I
really
mean,
killed me, especially having to try to
oh,
learn some
right.
of some of that in my work with Hellenistic astrology, just
Right.
because, yeah, that would be tremendously useful. And that's the thing that's cut off a lot of more recent, modern astrologers who've come about in the late 20th and early 21st century, is our lack of language skills
Hmm.
sort of has cut us off from the tradition, the earlier tradition, until recently when some translations have started to be made. And that's one of the things that I'm actually really surprised about in reading your book is I didn't realize it's been like 10 years because I've been focusing on Hellenistic astrology since I read any of Jung's work. And so I read it at a much earlier stage in my career. And I was very interested in his theories on synchronicity and wrote a term paper on it in like 2005, but then moved on to other things. But coming back to his work and reading your book now with all of his writings, I'm really struck by, yeah, how much he was drawing on the earlier tradition and how he also seems to have been aware of a lot of earlier astrological sources where it wasn't just that he had an academic approach to studying mythology or religious studies and psychology and things like that. But in astrology, he also had the ability to read primary source texts, and he appears to
Hmm.
have done that. And that seems to informed his astrological understandings to some extent.
Right. And I think we're going to learn a lot about this very shortly, because Liz Greene um, is just on the verge of having published a 2-volume work on Jung, also with Routledge. So this is very exciting. And maybe you know a little bit about this already, this anticipated work?
I mean, I just saw a reference to it in one of your footnotes, and then Nick
Okay.
Campion mentioned it to me in email asking if I was aware of it. But I'm actually extremely interested in that now, having just heard about it in the past couple of days, because that's my next question is what in developing his approach to astrology, at least by 1911, and then that became a lifelong, as we can
Mm.
learn very quickly in your book, astrology became a lifelong interest for him and something he integrated and used almost continuously. It seems like I'm very curious what were his sources and what sort of astrological influences did he have, both early in his career as well as later on.
Right. Yeah, me too. So, what I understand is that the Jung family gave Liz Greene access to his library, Jung's personal library, as well as the suitcase or two of papers that Jung's second daughter, Gret Bauman Jung, who was an astrologer, had kept. And Liz Greene has had that like unseen material from the suitcase, as well as access to his library. And so the first volume of her work is Jung's Studies of Astrology. And it's going to be a review commentary. I'm not exactly sure how it's been um, sort of framed, but we're going to be basically invited into understanding who he was reading, um, who influenced the way that he was looking at astrology, and how he was using it in his practice. So that's very, very exciting.
Yeah, that's going to be incredibly interesting. So I look forward to
Mm,
checking that out. And even just reading through your book and some of the excerpts that you guys picked out in order to demonstrate his references to and his statements about astrology. I saw some of the references he was making. He cites at least a couple of times the work of Bouche Leclerc, who wrote
hmm
a book titled Greek Astrology in French in like 1899 or something like that, at the very end of the 19th century, and it became like the standard academic work on Greco-Roman astrology, and for the most part, it has been for the past century.
mm,
And he cites that. So what it means is that Jung did like any good academic. He basically did a literature review of basically contemporary academic scholarship on astrology in the early 20th century, relatively early in his career. And then he also went back and read some of the primary source texts.
that's right.
So that in and of itself is interesting because that's one of the things that sets apart. Sometimes I feel like, there's been a movement over the past 20 or 30 years in the astrological community for astrologers to become more involved in academia. And that's often one of the things that you'll see that will set apart an astrologer that has some academic training is that they'll do that process of like the literature review, and they will take into account both contemporary discussions and the sort of like scholarship on the subject, but they'll also go back and focus on primary source texts and citing those texts and this sort of discussion and critical analysis of them. And that's something that makes Jung's work very unique is he really, and this is where it becomes interesting, the question of could we classify Jung as an astrologer, and
Mm,
how do you define that topic? And I would actually argue that using the definition of astrologer that I usually use, that Jung was an astrologer. And if that's true, if you could classify him as an astrologer, he would have actually become, or been in retrospect, one of the most notable and influential astrologers of the 20th century. When you were writing this book, I mean, obviously he's not usually classified as an astrologer. He's not usually treated that way. How do you feel about him, or how would you classify him, having read his works in the way that you did, or in the way that you put this book together?
Wow, that's such an interesting, such a great question. Well, I think I'd like to hear your definition of an astrologer. Like, how do you use that term? Or
Sure.
when do you, yeah. So, yeah.
Sure. So I would distinguish between an astrologer. Let's say the term astrologer is a generic term, and I usually the definition I use is that an astrologer, it's sort of a three-part definition, but a person who or one believes in astrology as a legitimate phenomenon, two has some background or training in the techniques associated with astrology, so actual, let's say, advanced training in astrology and its practices, and three actively uses it or applies it in their life in some way on a regular basis.
Mm.
So that distinction is important because there's many people, there's lots and lots of people, actually, I would argue the majority of the astrological community of people that you would consider to be astrologers who actively practice and use astrology and research or are enthusiasts about it, but who where their primary income is not necessarily through doing astrological consultations. So
Mm.
somebody like that you could classify more as, let's say, a professional astrologer where their primary vocation is practicing astrology, but there are lots of people because of the weird place that astrology occupies in society where that's not what they're primarily known for, even though it's the thing that they're passionate about, that they spend most of their time doing, even if it's not like their primary income. And he's one of those people who, even though his primary vocation and what he's known for is as being a psychologist, he spent a huge deal of time not just studying astrology and writing about it and talking about it, but also in some of the excerpts in your work, it sounds like he was not infrequently casting charts for some of the clients that he was talking to in order to get psychological insight from
Mhm.
that. So he was actually practicing astrology as part of his practice as a psychoanalyst. And to that extent, I think we could actually classify him as an astrologer.
Yeah, I mean, I think your definitions are great. Your qualifiers for using that the an astrologer. Yeah, I mean, I think Jung, and I think this is going to be made even more clear when Liz Greene's work comes out. But clearly, he had an astrological practice. I guess you know, But, just thinking about, his other fields of interest, I mean, I guess we could say that he was also an alchemist. I mean, if we're looking, if we are exploring his deep study of alchemy and his coming to recognize alchemy as being the historical backbone of his psychological theory, um, I yeah, so I
Right.
think that, it
No, that's a really good point because then he's an
mm,
alchemist. He's like a religious studies scholar. He's,
right,
a historian.
right.
He's a
A f
doctor. I
a
mean,
doctor, phenomenologist, I mean, because that is kind of a huge part of the work of a psychologist is to be present to the phenomenological appearance of symptoms and responses,
right.
yeah, it
And it's like, but that really does become an issue in the history of astrology in general, because sometimes many of the most, or some of the most prominent, quote unquote astrologers or people had an influence on the field of astrology were polymaths that were, good at a number of different things. So like Ptolemy, for example, in the second century was, he wrote influential works on optics, on geography, on astronomy, on harmonics, and he also wrote a book on astrology. And the book on astrology ended up being one of the most influential ones, but so that then there's a question, can you call him an
mm,
astrologer versus somebody who like Vedius Valens, who's a contemporary who that was his primary vocation and he didn't write works in other fields. Um, is Ptolemy still an astrologer is actually something that's debated. But I can also think of other people like, Richard Tarnas, who became prominent by publishing The Passion of the Western Mind,
mhm,
and through some of his other works, since he has other interests in the question of, is Tarnas an astrologer
mm.
versus is his primary vocation or the thing that he's primarily known for in other circles something else?
Mm, right, cosmologist, philosopher, historian. Yeah, I like the kind of ambivalence or the lack of clarity around these frames. And the reason for that is that I don't like the way, at least in kind of academia, there's been this really overwrought form of specialization that people become, specialists on one particular topic and sort of consumed by knowing an inordinate amount of information around a very particular inflection of a religious tradition or genre of literature, whatever that is. Um, I, which is not to say that I don't respect that kind of deep dive that people do, but I think it's when people are, like you were saying with Ptolemy, that there are linking overarching areas of interest that creativity really happens. And so I like not having a clear sense of it. I like our complexity because I think that our complexity of interests more honestly reflects the complexity of our nature.
Sure, definitely. And especially for
Mm.
somebody like him that's almost trying to create, or people like Jung or people like Ptolemy that are almost where their broader project or agenda is like a grand unified field theory, which, brings together many different fields and many different specializations and approaches. So to attempt to peg them with any one of those, it almost ends up being inaccurate for that reason because they're
Yeah.
creating something much larger than any one field. And additionally, to further sort of backtrack on my earlier attempts to peg him as an astrologer, it's interesting reading some of the excerpts in your book, which include some of his private correspondences with different people, which includes actually some prominent astrologers from the mid 20th century, where he corresponded with or wrote letters. You have excerpts from letters he wrote to André Barbeau, the famous French astrologer, as well as B.V. Raman, who was a very prominent Indian astrologer in the mid 20th century. And one of the things that's actually really interesting comparing some of those correspondences that I noticed versus when he was writing to Freud is that often when when he's talking with the astrologers, he comes off like a psychologist who's being approached by astrologers and then talking about the field as if he's outside of it. Whereas when in some of those brief snippets of the astrological discussions where he's talking with Freud, he comes off like an astrologer who's trying to convince Freud that he should pay attention to astrology. So there's this weird, sort of interesting dynamic in terms of that, even in terms of his interactions with people during his lifetime.
Oh yeah, it's nice that you pick that up. I mean, I guess it's the that old thing, know your audience.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. All right. So, but despite all of that, and despite those discussions, one of the things that becomes clear in reading your book and the different excerpts is how much of he was throughout different parts of his life, and you have different chapters where it talks about the way that he thought about and attempted to formulate how astrology worked and what it was capable of and why it was doing what it did. And it was really interesting to see what have become some of the formative principles and philosophical positions that modern astrologers or that contemporary astrologers in the late 20th and early 21st century would have become core principles for us were things that seem like
Hmm.
they were first fully formulated in Jung's work. And that's
Hmm.
to the extent that that's true, that's why I would say that he became, even if that wasn't his primary vocation, one of the most influential astrologers of the 20th century, just because he ended up laying down a number of foundational principles that later astrologers who were influenced by Jung incorporated into their work, like Dane Rudhyar
Mhm.
or Liz Greene or Stephen Arroyo.
Mm.
And through that, that ended up seriously influencing the modern astrological tradition.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and I guess this kind of brings us back to the idea of the way Jung said, well, astrology is really ancient psychology. So, in some sense, I mean, not to be sort of circular in the response, but yeah, I mean, if we kind of pierce astrology back again that way, that it's an ancient symbolic psychology. There we are. Mm.
Right, and I may think there's a way in which that's definitely true, but one of the things that's interesting is, for me, is having gone back and looked at the way that astrology was practiced in, like, let's say, the 2nd century. While there was sometimes a psychological component where there'll be like a chapter on studying character analysis or the psyche or the soul of the individual, a lot of it was very much oriented towards, concrete statements about concrete external events in a
Mm.
person's life or predictions. And Jung was part of an early development in early 20th century astrology where there was a push towards making astrology more psychological or using it in a more psychological context. And I think that's
Mhm.
the way in which he was influential. And maybe we can talk about and focus on from here on out, what was really his influence on the astrological tradition, or to what extent did he influence it?
Yeah, great.
So I think that's maybe the biggest thing that this book, now that we have all of his statements and sort of writings about astrology that you can fully assess, is that you can trace back where some of the core themes and concepts that show up so prominently or have become commonplace in modern astrology. You can actually trace a lot of those back to statements that he made starting in the early 20th century.
Right, yeah. Okay, so I think, specifically talking about psychological astrology as its own, um, I guess we would say the general orientation to astrology that looks particularly at psychological interpretation is, largely based on some of these, a few Jungian principles. I think the first is, um, in the most primary sense, um, in exploring the unconscious, our self knowledge deepens and expands. And, psychological astrology seeks to draw attention to and work with the unconscious aspects through the symbolism of the birth chart. And in this way, our awareness is expanded when we connect experiences and issues to the archetypal patterns in the chart. So, this recognition of the reality of the unconscious is really, primary to a depth, both Freudian, but particularly Jungian psychology. So, I mean, I think that would be, the, first sort of primary thing that comes up.
Sure, and using astrology, or using especially the birth chart in particular as an access point for doing that, for doing something essentially that you would otherwise try to do through just talking with the client or the patient or what have you. But for Jung, it seemed like sometimes in one of the excerpts, he said if he had a difficult case, he would sometimes default to the chart in order to get a better access point for what he would otherwise try to approach more indirectly.
Right, or like, it's like when I'm, working with the client and they're maybe talking about their sort of desire, to be in relationship in a more full way and they're, trying to express that by talking about what's going on. But then if I'm looking at their chart and I can see that, they have a Saturn Venus opposition, the just that symbolism of seeing that Saturn Venus opposition um, is uh, recognizing that's giving me access to a sense of sort of a sense of distance or difficulty or fearfulness around the kind of Venusian need for intimacy. That helps me um, sort of become more resonant to what the person is saying to me or where the challenge really is. So it isn't always getting caught up in, the specifics of what's happening in the relationship here and now, but rather what's kind of the underlying. challenge or tension that the person always experiences when it comes to intimacy. You see what I
Right.
mean? And I
Yeah.
think that's the way that Jung was talking about it, is that the chart can help us kind of cut through, not cut through, but maybe see through more quickly into those core, archetypal configurations, so to speak.
Right. Just knowing from the astrologer's perspective that there's some sort of Venus Saturn archetype, or there's some archetype that's operating in the person's life that might be represented or can be accessed by understanding what a Venus Saturn combination means. And then perhaps if talking to them about some specific scenario that they're struggling with in their love life, or some desire that they have, or some issue that they have specifically, and realizing, or the astrologer being able to recontextualize that, or look at it in the broader sense as being a manifestation of this broader theme that's sort of a recurring theme throughout their life, and being able to address it from that perspective rather than just focusing on the specific or particular manifestation of one particular instance of that, of like, I don't know, getting dumped or something like that, versus a recurring Venus Saturn theme that's sort of manifesting in their life.
That's right. Yeah, for sure. And I think we can even take it another step further and say, um, how can we then talk to the client about learning to more deeply value the gifts that come with that Venus Saturn, and not just try to find ways to get around it? So that's what I was meaning earlier about this sense of like living into our chart, like living into that which is kind of drawing us forward in terms of individuation, which includes our difficulties and challenges and incapacities, Um, so yeah, I think that's right on.
Sure. So it becomes much more process oriented because there's that
Mm,
underlying goal of individuation. And then it becomes, there's more emphasis, I think, on psychological development rather than just attempting to make concrete predictions about what will happen in the person's life, but instead trying to use the chart and the astrological placements, whether they're natal placements or transits, as an access point for psychological growth and
mm.
internal growth rather than just talking about material or external circumstances.
That's right, right. So I think, I mean, that would be, another one of those main principles that seem to be, taken from Jungian psychology, which is this emphasis on psychological development. So astrology, um, as a guide to the way in which we deepen or expand, is expressed in a number of ways. Foremost being that the perspective that the birth chart is symbolic of an individual soul, their potential, and it also reveals how people experience life. Their perceptive attitude towards certain fields of experience. And that the chart also shows us the nature of our complexes and our calling. So that in working with the chart, with those perspectives, then there's all of these opportunities for, um, suggestions on how to approach different areas of our life, and valuing, those different gifts and challenges that come with it.
Right.
And I think, oh, no, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, well, I don't know. Are you familiar with the writing of Alice O. Howell?
Yeah, a little bit. I've read one of her books like a while back.
Yeah, she was a Jungian analyst, and also an astrologer, and she actually passed away a couple of years ago. I didn't have the opportunity to meet her in person, but I know a couple of people that did, and she just struck me as being kind of one of those salty wise women. And she has this amazing quote that I included in part of the introduction to the book, and I wanted to read it here because I just think it's so uh, appropriate. Where she writes that the birth chart is in potentia a treasure map to the individuation process or greater awareness of the self. And I am using self in Jung's definition of the word as meaning the center and totality of the psyche. The chart will impel us unconsciously, as do our complexes, until we become more conscious. So, I mean, I just think that really encapsulates this idea that the chart is a way of working with our psyche. It's a tool for development.
Right, that it's indicating areas in which you will have growth and sometimes, challenges that might come up, but that the purpose of even looking at those challenges, and that's one of the major developments in modern astrology, was reframing, quote unquote, challenging planets or challenging placements as being opportunities for growth and transformation. And that's
Mm,
really striking, seeing that as something that seems to originate with Jung, because even though that's become so commonplace, and it almost seems obvious to us in a modern early 21st century context, when I see Jung talking about some of these concepts and I understand how that contrasts with how his contemporaries were talking about astrology, like Alan Leo, and or even in Germany, I did a previous episode in December with about Elsbeth Eberton and some of her
mm,
mundane predictions and things like that. That was not their orientation. While there was certainly a trend, especially with some of the theosophical astrologers, towards a more sort of like spiritual New Age astrology and the idea of spiritual evolution or growth in some way. And while with Alan Leo, especially, there was a push towards astrology being used more for character analysis. There's a radical departure going on here in the way that Jung is talking about how astrology should be used in a psychological context. And I never fully realized, because it's like Jung himself primarily seems to have influenced the astrological tradition through intermediaries, because he got picked up very early on by figures like Dane Rudhyar, who started
mhm,
talking about and incorporating some of Jung's ideas as early as his 1936 book, The Astrology of Personality. And then later you have people like Liz Greene, who became very popular and seriously integrated lots of things from Jung's psychology, as well as other figures that you guys cite in the book at one point, like Alice O'Howell or Stephen Arroyo. And,
mhm.
and it's sort of through those intermediaries that Jung has this major impact eventually on the astrological tradition, especially in that generation that came in the 1960s and 70s. But it was surprising to me, seeing the excerpts in your book, how many of the foundational principles of modern astrology that he had already either stated or sort of alluded to already in some of his writings pretty early on.
I really, really value hearing your perspective because I think you have a much stronger, perspective and arc on the history of astrology. So it's great to hear um, the way that you're really seeing the influence that Jung had and where it kind of slots in and starts to kind of ripple out. I really, it's great for me to hear you talk about this.
Yeah, and just my process of reading this book over the past week has been interesting as a result of that, because I was surprised, and I think some people will be surprised reading this, because these are ideas that have become commonplace, but you have to realize that so many of them actually were somewhat unique.
Mm,
Yeah, or ideas that become more well fleshed out or have become standardized as like an approach or a school of astrology, like, archetypal astrology and the approach to astrology that Richard Tarnas has set up, and how many of the foundational principles where he seems to have been sort of influenced by Jung. I think that was the other thing that was interesting there as well. Not in like a negative way, in like lifting things, or not giving acknowledgement, since he clearly does, and recognized Jung and the important role that he played. But I was just surprised, sometimes when you come in as a later or a more recent generation, there are certain assumptions that are being made by your contemporaries, or certain things that everyone's doing that you assume are commonplace. But
mm,
when you go back like a few decades and you see less and less, or you see fewer and fewer people making the same assumptions or making the same statements, you realize sometimes how recent certain conceptualizations are. So, for example, that was something we've talked about a few months ago with the nodes and the idea that the north node has to do with your future and the south node has to do with your past lives or something. And how, while that's taken oftentimes as commonplace now, it's a relatively recent development over the past few decades. And there's just certain concepts like that that I saw or sort of recognize as relatively recent in the broader context of things, but where you can really see Jung as being the originator in some sense.
Right. Yeah. No, it's really terrific because it's so important. And I guess this is more on our sort of scholarly tip, but it's so important to be cognizant of these waves and shifts of ideas. And that kind of because it informs the field, it informs the very assumptions that we make. And with enough time between trends or sort of paradigms of understanding, we can look back and begin to kind of see larger patterns at work in a field of study, which is so interesting, you know.
Right.
So yeah, I think this is an important part of the astrological field, which circumscribes these aspects, not just astrology as practice, but the ideas of the history of ideas, and how and what's informed them.
Right, definitely. And that provides a good segue to the last section, which is just
Mm,
some of the theoretical assumptions behind astrology and the formative influence that Jung played on those, because there's a few other concepts like that it seems like we can trace back to him. So the big one, or one of the really important, like sort of almost the elephant in the room, is his work on synchronicity
mm.
and the sort of theoretical conceptualization underlying how and why astrology works. And this is almost such a big topic that it almost deserves an episode on its own. So we don't have to go too far in attempting to articulate it here. But you guys have at least a chapter. I mean, a large part of the book is devoted to, I think you identify 7 different ways in which he, or formulations that he had during the course of his career about how he tried to conceptualize how astrology worked. And one of the major ones was his attempt to articulate the concept of synchronicity. Could you talk a little bit about that, or what that was as a concept and how he conceptualized it?
Yeah, yeah. So but just to underscore what you said, I mean, this is a huge topic, and it would be really great if you had another interview, conversation with some people on synchronicity, and I think Kieran would be terrific in this regard. So
Yeah,
just to kind of,
and I will, because he
mm,
originally he was going to be. We had some technical difficulties, otherwise we would have had him on
mm,
today. And
right.
I think, having read, he wrote the introduction to part 4 of the book, right, where these 7 different conceptualizations are articulated.
That's right. Yeah. So, and this is just a little side note about the way the book was constructed. We actually divvied up the sections. And so Kieran worked on the first and the fourth, the first being the context of astrology and Jung's ideas, and then the fourth being the theoretical ideas around astrology. So those were his fields, and I took care of the two in the middle of the book. So synchronicity shows up as, um, I mean, it's so huge a topic just in terms of depth psychology, but in the most hopefully simply rendered sketch I can give, synchronicity can best be defined as the connection between events that are, and that connection is not causal, meaning like it's not a mechanical causal event that because the sun is in Leo, it's then emanating leonine energy and affecting people with that kind of leonine attitude, and they're going to go about and do leonine kinds of things for the day or the month or whatever that is. It's a kind of mechanistic causal image. Synchronicity talks about the connections that happen between events that are acausal. So psychologically, we most frequently talk about this, that an inner experience and an outer event are experienced as connected, but solely through the meaning that we make between the inner and the outer, rather than any cause and effect link between the two.
Right. So he basically posited, and this is partially important because although there was an earlier astrological tradition that used or conceptualized astrology as working in a purely symbolic sense or through
Mm,
signs or omens or divination, like in the Mesopotamian tradition, from the second century forward, due to the influence of Ptolemy, there was a strong trend in the astrological tradition that conceptualized astrology as working because the planets emitted some sort of physical mechanism or force which
right.
influenced life on Earth and people and our characters and destinies and what have you. And Jung was one of the first figures who came along relatively early in the 20th century and developed or put forward this theory that the mechanism underlying astrology, that astrology could work not through some sort of physical mechanism, but instead through some sort of acausal mechanism, which he referred to as synchronicity.
Right. And so a synonym for synchronicity is meaningful coincidence, right? Where, so again, so let's take our birth chart as an example. The location of the planets at the time of our birth do not cause us to have the characteristics that we have. Rather, there's a meaningful coincidence between the planetary alignment and our psychological character or state. I mean, and
Right.
I think another way that we could say that, using again more Jungian language, is that we could call this that the the planetary alignment and the personal experience are connected because there's the constellation of an archetype, right? The
Sure.
planetary alignment gives us an image or a symbol by which to say, oh, is that what's going on? You see?
Right. Or even more simple language is to say that it's a reflection of what's happening, rather than being the direct cause of what's happening. So in the same
Mm,
way that like the common sort of analogy that's used by most contemporary modern astrologers is just the way that like the clock on the wall says that it's 5 p.m. right now, that it's reflecting the time, but it's not necessarily the cause or the reason why it is that time. In the same way, the planets can somehow reflect things that are happening in a person's life or can reflect psychological complexes or their character or personality or what have you without necessarily being the cause or the reason that a person is the way that they are.
right, right. That's right.
Sure.
So, but I think that the thing that's really important from Jung's perspective about synchronicity is, um, something is a synchronicity when it's meaningful to the person. Do you know what I mean? When it strikes you as like, that it has a sort of weight or a force, or it seems to clarify something in terms of what you need. And so that, I think, goes, that dovetails into the sort of awakening or healing capacity of astrology. Is and I'm you as a practicing astrologer too. I mean, the way someone can experience a huge amount of relief or a sense of being seen or being validated by the way that you can talk about the symbols of their chart or the transit that they're experiencing, and they feel met in a very deep way. Um, so it's like the potency of that sense has to do with the meaningfulness that comes between the event and the person. You see what I mean?
Yeah, and that's part of a broader sort of issue of the distinction between the way that Jung was trying to explore and articulate this idea of synchronicity, of this broader phenomenon that he was seeing that was almost an explanatory principle for weird sort of fringe stuff that would happen occasionally in a person's life or in consciousness versus the way that the astrological community and astrologers later adopted or appropriated aspects of that as an explanatory mechanism for astrology. And there's I think different astrologers like Maggie Hyde, for example, who you cite at one point in the book, in her book on Jung and astrology, really talks about the disconnect to some extent between the way that Jung talked about synchronicity versus the way that astrologers sometimes use that term to explain what they're doing and how.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, I think so. I
Yeah, so in terms of the distinction between, synchronicity, it's a huge and broad topic. So I think we'll save that for the full exploration of that for a future discussion. But just the idea that he introduced the notion, or at least discussed in a contemporary context, was one of the first authors to discuss the idea that astrology might not work through causes or through causal forces, but instead there might be another principle at play that explained the mechanism for how astrology could work, even if the planets are not literally influencing life on Earth.
yeah, great.
All right. So, the very last thing that I wanted to mention in terms of his contributions to the astrological tradition or influence on the astrological tradition was his use of mythology as a interpretive tool in order to understand the archetypes underlying astrology, because this is another one of those areas where even though this has become commonplace in contemporary astrology to use the name associated with the planet or a celestial body, or to use the mythology or the story associated with that name in order to understand what it means in astrology more. It's actually a relatively recent phenomenon to some extent. It was not done as explicitly in the earlier astrological tradition than as you might expect, given how common it has become today. And I can really see in some of these excerpts where you spend a lot of time sort of talking about or having excerpts from some of his discussions about mythology, where he would use that as an access point for understanding the planets, or sometimes using the planets as an access point for mythology. And that started a very rich tradition, which especially ramped up with figures like Liz Greene, of looking to the mythology of the planets in order to understand their astrological meaning. And sometimes even in an astrological consultation, astrologers like Demetra George, they would see a certain planet being prominent in a chart, and they would talk about the myth associated with that planet and use that as an interpretive device or a device for exposition in astrology. And it's interesting seeing that again as a almost principle that Jung is sort of pioneering in his work in a very basic form that would eventually become more prominent later in the century.
Yeah, again, it's terrific to hear that reflection of yours in relationship to the longer arc of astrological practices and ideas. And I think, looking back to Jung and the way we understand mythology from this depth perspective is that by working with the stories, and this is whether, I'm working with an astrological client or if an analyst is working with the patient, the stories talking about Persephone um, being abducted or taken down into the underworld and being separated from everything she knows. That story and just that image, and helping someone kind of imagine into it and imagine into how they feel that there's a resonance between the story and their own experience at that point of depression or loss of a relationship, or of something important to them, is so much fuller of an experience than talking about the concept of depression or loss. You see what I mean? Or even to talk about a transit of Saturn. I mean, a transit of Saturn for us astrologers, it's like we're full of rich, amazing images that go with that. But when we're talking with a new client or someone that hasn't really done this work before or isn't in the tradition in some way, that doesn't mean anything. We might as well be talking about, infantile regression and compensatory, processes. It's all conceptual language that draws us away, can very often draw us away from the life of the experience that we're having. And so I think mythology, as I had said earlier, it's the archetypes personified. It's the archetypes walking around in bodies and engaging in certain actions and having certain storylines always being what's going on. And so we're actually seeing in motion these great orienting principles to life. And they're much easier to connect to in story form. So I think that it's a valuing of the imagination, and it's a valuing of mythopoetic language, which is, another way to say that storytelling and reading good stories or being drawn to story helps us see ourselves or feel the resonance of our situation with a character in a way that can actually render some illumination, awareness, perspective on our situation.
Right.
So I think that's the psychological use of mythology, that, as you said, found a very rich and vibrant thread in the astrological practices.
Right. And his interest and familiarity with both the astrology as well as mythology and mythological studies, and the thing tying them together is this notion of the archetypes, and therefore the notion that these myths, or like ancient myths, are not just, stories that somebody made up a long time ago, but instead they can hold deeper wisdom and insight and can be used in a very tangible way to invoke, or to evoke, very primal feelings and notions, especially within the context of an astrological consultation, because of the almost like interchangeability between myth and archetype and astrological symbol.
Yeah, that's right. And this will open the door to a whole nother conversation, but I think it's really important too to just note that um, Jung's working with mythology really came into play in his working with schizophrenic and psychotic patients, because as he was listening to their stories about what was happening and what they were experiencing day by day, he started to notice um, like interesting images or figures that they were talking about. And as he started to do research, he found that in these fantasies were like ancient mythic figures that he knew for a fact that that person at the Bergholzli did not have any knowledge of, personal knowledge of. They didn't study, Peruvian mythology or whatever it was. So it was actually in a very phenomenological way that Jung began to see that in the depths of psychic chaos and experience psychic fantasy, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but just in the psychological life and stories that we live. Mythological images and symbols and figures were arising from basically the collective unconscious, and were walking around in people's dreams and in people's fantasies and their psychoses. So I'm just saying this because I think it's important that people understand that that connection was made by Jung because of what he was seeing happen in his patients. And that led him to then more deeply study mythology, because he realized there are underlying patterns um, that people experience in relationship to certain situations. And so the more we can come to recognize the pattern, i.e., recognize Saturn's transit, just to make a connection there, then we can more kind of readily sort of get a sense of, well, what's going on for this person?
Sure.
What's needed, what's missing, what's blocked. You see what I mean?
Yeah, that
Um,
makes sense, and
yeah.
that became then a whole interpretive approach, or an approach to
Mm,
doing astrology, in late 20th and early 21st century astrology, in terms of using myth as a rich sort of resource, and as a tool, both as a tool to draw on in terms of past myths, and using them in that way in a consultation in order to connect clients, and help them to understand the archetypes that were manifesting in their life, or that they were dealing with. But also, even in a more research oriented way, it became a new principle. It was somewhat new to some extent, or at least I would argue that it was somewhat new, where astrologers were developing new understandings of celestial bodies that were initially, or sometimes solely, predicated on the myth associated with the name that was assigned to the celestial body, rather than, let's say, a different approach should be more, let's say, empirical, in terms of like looking at the transit of this planet happened to this point at this point in time, and this event occurred, and then developing or inferring what the celestial body means based on that. But instead, astrologers often will first go to the myth, and they'll say, there's this new celestial body that's been called Sedna,
mm,
or Eris, or what have you. And oftentimes now the first sort of access point for attempting to understand the meaning of the celestial body is, what is the myth associated with that name, under the premise that the name given to the planet was, um, not random, but instead through synchronicity, or through what have you, that it was well given, or given in a way that does actually invoke or match what the symbolic meaning of the celestial body is.
right. Yeah. I think this is such a great piece that you're bringing in here, because I do think the case, with with the main, the two lights and the five planets up until Saturn obviously are on point, and we have a couple thousand years of quantitative and qualitative um, research to have us understand this. And so there is this sense that, wow, it's just amazing, the synchronistic, or the synchronicity that led to the naming of those planets to those particular divinities and all of that. And your point is also very apt, I think, and which is, um, at the same time, we have to stay very open and aware of the phenomenological evidence or data that shows up when we're looking at the influence or effect of certain planets or asteroids or whatever that is. And I think a really beautiful example of this work is Rick Tarnas's slender volume Prometheus the Awakener. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So basically, he does what you were, in a way suggesting, which is Uranus, in many ways, is not really a great name or a great god for the Uranian planetary effects. They don't really square to one another. And so,
Right. Or that's the thesis of his argument, at least.
right. And so he instead looks to Prometheus, so drawing very heavily on biographical data and sketches. Looks at the Uranian effect as really being more evocative of a Promethean archetypal pattern. And I think it's wonderful and deep, at the same time. So there's both. So I think at least that's how I heard you. That there's a sense of we have to kind of hold both the at times the fittedness, the rightness between the naming and the kind of characteristics or qualities or energy, however you will, of that particular astrological factor. But we also have to really pay attention to its lived experience, and does that make sense?
Right. Well, it's one of the interesting legacies of Jung in pioneering the mythological approach is that astrologers sometimes would take it's become like a mainline interpretive principle, but sometimes it proceeds or is taken to extreme instead of any sort of empirical observation. But the pioneering of that approach over the course of the past century has had that as an interesting side effect. But then when you run
Mm.
into instances like Tarnas's argument about Uranus, and where he basically, as you just said, he basically argues that the myth of Uranus doesn't actually match the astrological interpretation of this body, but instead the myth of Prometheus matches much better the sort of interpretive value that astrologers have empirically found to be associated with that planet. But then that raises the question, does that mean then that not all myths that are associated with certain celestial bodies will synchronistically be appropriate? And therefore, if that's the case, that raises a whole philosophical and sort of practical issue about what's become a mainstream assumption that most contemporary
Mm.
astrologers make about your starting point for generating astrological significations based on mythology.
Right. And, not to, throw another, thing in the pot here, but I think, it's also often much more rich when talking with people about their experience when I'm working with the client that I'm not necessarily talking about the myth of Saturn in relationship to a Saturn transit that they're experiencing, but rather some other mythic figure who is very evocative of the sense of kind of discipline and a sense of really, needing to stay with fundamentals and be sorting and seeding things. Because there are other figures and stories that give form to that particular archetype. And so I think it's important to be more multiplicitous, and even in the way that we mythologically amplify the planets or the asteroids.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, maybe we could do a
Yeah.
follow-up discussion on some point about the use of mythology as an interpretive principle in astrology, and we could like expand upon that more.
Yeah, I'd love that because I think another thing that fits into that is the inclusion of feminine figures, feminine figures in relationship to what we generally characterize as masculine gods and so yeah, that would be fun.
Right, that's been one of the big that was one of the points I think Demetra George made early on in her work of the asteroids was that the
Mm.
majority of the planets were named after men and therefore or were ascribed to male deities, and there were only two, at least female deities, which is the moon and Venus. And it was only with the discovery of the asteroids over the past few decades that suddenly we've started to have female celestial bodies or drawing on the mythology of those.
Right, but there are many different figures that we could talk about as being Jupiterian that are feminine. I mean, just think about Demeter. This mother nurturing goddess of the grain. All she wants is for things to grow. I mean, if we just look at her values, we could say, wow, there's something very Jupiterian about that. And then
Oh,
for, in relationship to someone's chart or their particular situation, that might be so much more of a connecting figure for them to kind of think about rather than talking about Zeus and, whatever he's getting up to. You know what I mean?
okay, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. So not adopting too strict of an approach to only sticking with the mythology of one mythology, but instead the multivalent nature of different planetary archetypes can lend itself towards using different myths that are actually appropriate within the symbolism of a planet.
Exactly.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense actually, and that would broaden and sort of resolve that issue for me that Tarnas's argument about Prometheus brought up, which is, just what are the implications of that if something's almost been misassigned to mythology, you might say.
Right. And, if we're talking about archetypal patterns, how could we even, consider limiting the whole constellation of what we would call Saturnian experience to one myth, one
Right.
figure? I mean, that seems very reductive in some way. So isn't it more rich to become more connected to the qualitative characteristics and to begin to identify those in many different valences, many different figures and
Sure.
styles of expression? So to me, that's what when I talk about archetypal astrology, to me, that's an archetypal approach. So that you're following the archetype. You're not getting caught in one figure that renders it.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that starts to bring us to the end of this discussion. So, are there any points about Jung? I mean, to sort of wrap it up, Jung, eventually he passed away in 1961, and his work has had profound influence on a number of different fields, but especially astrology. I think as we've gone through some of these different topics, we've started to see, and I think people who get this book, and I would highly recommend that all astrologers do get this book, because I think it's going to become a core sort of assigned or required reading text for most astrologers in their library in order to understand, the true foundations of modern astrology and many of these concepts that we're talking about and using, or that we take for granted here, like the use of mythology or the use of archetypes, or the references to synchronicity or what have you. Yeah, I mean, was that your intention, or what was your intention with the book, or did you have that? Was it more of like a just an odyssey that you went through, and where do you feel like you ended up at the end?
Well, I just want to say I just really thank you so much for what you just said. That feels so affirming of what was the hoped for end product, which was a book that felt um, like a real addition to understanding the perspective and influence of Jung on astrology in general. And I mean, we did it also for the other side, which was for psychologists, psychoanalysts, Jungians that were also looking for ways maybe to step more fully into embracing the astrological tradition. I just think there's so much that can be done there as well. So we hoping that it sort of spoke to both sides of the conversation. Um,
Sure. It'll
so
certainly be harder, I think, for anyone who's interested in Jungian astrologies with this book out there to overlook or sort of ignore that component of Jung's thought, now that it's all collected in a nice, concise, but relatively comprehensive volume like this. And I mean, the other thing that's really striking about it, just from an external observer standpoint, is you are two academics who are talking about astrology in a mainstream publication from a major publisher, and you're talking very openly about the subject, even despite that, and also talking about it. You're not downplaying it, but I was almost struck a few times by how you were still talking about it as if it was a legitimate phenomenon, even though you were talking to an academic audience. And I realized part of that is because you can get away with that because it's in the context of talking about Jung, who himself thought it was a legitimate phenomenon. But I almost still would have thought that you would hold back a little bit more than you did from treating it so openly, or being so open about your own astrological views, both you and your co-author. So that was another interesting thing from like an academic standpoint, is seeing some of the results of Tarnas's school and some of that
mm,
work that's happened, and some of the results of that, because astrologers have wondered for a while now what would be the results of some astrologers trying to push into academia, and would any headway be made. And this book is, I think, easily one of the most notable developments in terms of that in quite some time.
thank you. That's Yeah, thank you very much for saying that. And I think you're right to sort of locate Tarnas in this sort of development. I think you're right that there's a lot to be said about um, the impact of Cosmos and Psyche, um, and um, I'm sure there are other factors too, um, but you're painting a very persuasive picture.
Sure. Well, I mean, because the thing
Yeah.
about Cosmos and Psyche when it came out is we didn't know, is this going to be the watershed moment where, everyone starts taking astrology seriously? And in some ways, it was slightly disappointing because it wasn't. But
Hmm.
one of the things that's really interesting in talking to you and now and seeing your work and seeing this book is his work did influence some people in a very significant way and did influence subsequent generations in a way that might not have been immediately clear or immediately perceptible, but now we are starting to see the results of that, and it's a big deal.
Yeah, it is. And I just want to say too, I mean, your contribution, just with doing the podcast, because of the way in which you, as I've already said a couple times, your sense of the history and development of the study of astrology and the practice of astrology, and your interest in really drawing attention to that, contextualizing things. I mean, it's a really important part of establishing this field in at these various levels, whether it's academic or it's more praxis oriented or more, kind of more spiritually meaning oriented. But I think I feel like um, pieces are really coming together to shift the field in a new way, or to give I don't know. I think something's afoot, I guess, in the most kind of vague, intuitive way that I can say that. That we're coming into a new valence of talking about what we're doing. And to me that's really exciting.
Yeah, definitely. I feel the same way. All right. Well, I think this is bringing us to the end of this discussion. It's been a long, winding sort of road, but I'm really excited. I'm really glad that we got a chance to do this today. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast, Chris. It has been a wonderful experience.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit. So where people can find out more information about your work and some of the things that you're working on right now, or some of the things that you have coming up. So you have a website, right?
Yeah, I have a website. It's thearchetypaleye.com. And I have a blog where I'm doing some occasional writing. I also do astrological consultations, so people can find more information about those things by visiting my website. Um, and I also have a new article in this newest edition of the Mountain Astrologer. So people can check that out if they wanted a sense of. It's not about Jung, it's about Neptune and the myth of Ariadne. So, kind of harkening back to the last topic we touched on, looking at Neptune, Neptune's influences from a feminine figure. Um, and lastly, I'm going to be at Norwalk, the Pacific Northwest Astrology Conference in March, and then also at the UAC United Astrology Conference in May in Chicago, where I hopefully will get to meet you in person.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. So you're going to be speaking at that conference. So yeah, we'll actually meet for the first time there in Chicago in May. And what's your talk on that you're giving there?
I'm going to be talking about James Hillman, the archetypal psychologist, and looking at how his major work, Revisioning Psychology, which was written in 1975 and nominated for the Pulitzer, how some of his ideas in revisioning psychology can really sort of open up our way of looking at. Astrology itself. So, the way we practice from a more psychological perspective, but drawing on Hillman's work in particular.
Brilliant. That should be great. I'm looking forward to that. I know a lot of people who've been on the podcast over the years are going to be there at that conference, and I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, great.
And then I think your co-author is doing a workshop here in March as well that I wanted to make sure we plug because he's giving a workshop on the archetypal nature of Neptune, I believe, right?
Yeah, yeah. So Kieran's been doing a number of workshops on the transpersonal planets through the Institute of Transpersonal and Archetypal Studies. And they have a website. It's itas-psychology.com, or just people can Google Institute of Transpersonal and Archetypal Studies. And then, so in March, the 3rd and 4th in Manhattan, he's going to be doing a workshop on Neptune. So some East Coasters might be keen to do that, which would be terrific, of course.
Brilliant. Yeah, I would definitely recommend checking that out, especially if any of the sort of approaches or concepts that we've talked about during the course of this episode have been interesting to anyone or have been new concepts or things that you want to follow up on. I think the work that both of you guys are doing really exemplifies a lot of the best threads of that. So I'd recommend people check out those events and check out those websites for more information.
Great. Thank you.
All right. And your book is titled Jung on Astrology. And when was it published? Like, what was the actual, is there a date?
It was published in October of this past year, so it's only a few months old. So still fresh.
Brilliant. Okay. And people can find that on Amazon or in fine bookstores everywhere. And I definitely recommend people check it out. And then hopefully we can do a follow-up discussion at some point on the use of mythology and astrology. And I'll try to talk with your co-author at some point about maybe doing an episode on synchronicity or something like that.
Terrific. I really look forward to more conversations with you, Chris. This has been a great pleasure.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks for joining me. I think we'll
Okay.
close up for the day. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time. Hey, special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Christy Moe, Ariana Amor, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, and Melissa Delano. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through our page on patreon.com. In exchange, you can get access to bonus content that's only available to patrons of the podcast, such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the monthly forecast episodes, our monthly auspicious elections podcast, or another exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. If you're looking to get an astrological consultation, we have a new list of astrologers that have been on the podcast before and who we recommend for readings at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. There you'll find astrologers who offer different types of consultations, including birth chart readings, synastry, rectification, electional astrology, horary questions, and more. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called Solar Fire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called Astro Gold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of Solar Fire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code ASTROPODCAST15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. You can get a print copy of the book through Amazon or other online retailers, or there's an ebook version available through Google Books. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology, where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts, as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine, which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com.